good things about it. Alrighty, I think maybe we can get started. I'm going to go ahead and just introduce Alix here. In this talk, Alix is going to be going through her, education and career journey to using data science and machine learning specifically for medical applications. She'll give an overview of classes of machine learning algorithms, examples of how they apply in medicine, specifically in neurology. And finally, she'll give an overview of how the industry uses computer science for drug discovery and development. And then Alix, feel free to take it from here.
Thank you. It's great to be here at my alma mater. So my talk has 3 parts. I will start to talk about my windy journey here. I did not start out as a computer science major. Then I'll talk about some of the classes of machine learning and examples of how they apply in medicine. I know you hear machine learning all the time, and some of you may know very well what we're talking about, and others may be like, oh, what is it? And how does it work in the real world? So I'll give you at least some snapshots about how we use it as well in drug discovery, which is a problem of finding new treatments for diseases that are not well treated currently. All right, so starting with my journey. So my journey in images, it's really been windy. Like I said, I started out, I studied my high school was in France, so my family's from France, but my mom's American. So I was lucky enough to have dual citizenship and be able to apply for college in the US. As some of you who have applied from abroad, you know that it's not easy when you don't have, the counselors and everybody who can help you with the college application process. And it's also a lot more expensive than other countries. That's partly why my journey was windy. I started at UC Santa Cruz, the speedy slug reading Plato. That is pretty much what I was into, not so much into high intensity sports, but really I wanted to further my education and just learn about other fields like philosophy, like psychology, things that you're not really exposed to as a high school student. So it was really an amazing year because I was able to satisfy my need for freedom of learning and intellectual curiosity. I was not so much into maths, and I hadn't been exposed to computer science at that time. I really like the disciplines that involve storytelling and mysteries, which biology has plenty of. So that's how I really got into biology. But unfortunately, because of financial circumstances, I had to leave the 4-year college. But luckily, I had some family in the area that let me live with them, and I went to community college. And I decided to focus on filmmaking. So for 2 years, I was really into making films. Again, there's this storytelling visual aspect that you'll see is kind of weaving through my whole story. And then after 2 years, I realized I did not want to be a struggling artist, partly because my mother struggles and I really wanted to be able to help her in the future. And I'm sure that resonates with many of you. And also because maybe I wasn't so much of an artist, and maybe the roles in film weren't all super creative. So, and also because I loved learning, and everyone was like, "Well, you can just drop out of school if you don't, if you want to study film." But I really wanted to go back to school, to continue school. So fortunately, thanks to an uncle who harassed me about applying to Berkeley, even though I thought I could pay for it, I did apply and I did get in. So again, very grateful for those influences in my life who helped me persist when I didn't really believe in it. And so when I arrived to Berkeley as a film student, I knew I wanted to switch to something. And I was always interested in the brain. Again, how can the brain tell stories? So it was really, I realized, sorry, I have notes from my talk here that I forgot to remove. So ignore the text. And one thing that I was always really interested in is being a neuroscientist. And But my dad had told me, oh, I think you have to be a doctor for that. And I thought, I don't really want to be a medical doctor. I'm really much more interested in being a researcher. And so that was one thing that discouraged me from continuing from studying neuroscience earlier on. But at Berkeley, I discovered there were plenty of labs with scientists who were a doctor. And so I pursued molecular and cell biology, which was a little hard coming from film, but again, because I really love learning and I persisted, it worked out, and I really wanted to continue, and I decided to do a PhD. I applied to a bunch of universities, decided to go to Harvard. So that's where I ended up in the MCB department here. And I was really fascinated, and still am, by how the brain encodes sensory stimuli and then makes a decision based on the environment. And that's the kind of basis of what the brain does. It senses its environment and makes some computation, and then it decides on a behavior. Turns out that the fish, the little larval zebrafish, makes life and death decisions all the time because it does not want to be eaten. It would rather eat something than be eaten. And so there's actually a really interesting neural circuit, as we call it, a bunch of neurons, cells in the brain that make this computation and that decide based on a sensory stimuli, which can be a tap or a sound, whether or not to escape. And the fish is like God. If you've ever seen, a fish tank and tapped on the fish tank, you sometimes see that the fish move really, really rapidly. And that's the behavior that's mediated through this neural circuit, the escape circuit. I was also really interested in what controls sleep and wake states. And it turns out that the zebrafish has these cells that code for a protein that is involved in human narcolepsy, which is a problem in sleep and wake behaviors. That didn't work out so much. We did a lot of sleep experiments and had some problems with reproducibility. But that actually taught me a lot about problem solving, first of all, but also about doing robust analyses. And so fast forward, 6 years as a PhD, but towards the end of the PhD, there were many failed experiments, many hours in the basement of the biolab. And I realized I just really love the data analysis part. So again, to me, this is really about storytelling. But I realized that my medium for storytelling is data. I do love to analyze data and tell stories about them to understand what it means and find patterns. And the visualization side also is one that I really love because of my love for visual images and so I had to learn some C# to create the software early on in my PhD for tracking the tail of the zebrafish, as you can see here. And that was really interesting. It was scary, but ultimately what I did is I did a lot of data analysis in MATLAB, which is common for the health sciences to use MATLAB. So I picked up a lot on my own. I did not have any formal training in CS, which is slightly unfortunate, I think, still to this day. So kudos to you who are in computer science departments. But at the same time, it also, again, helped me know that I can learn stuff on my own, even when I didn't have a formal education in it. While I was in my 5th year, I realized I did not want to be in academia. I really was interested more in real world problems rather than knowledge for knowledge sake, which earlier on I was more interested in knowledge for knowledge sake, but I've changed, as people do. And so I convinced a friend of mine who led a lab at IBM Research, which was one night at his birthday party, that I could do an internship with him. And he's a computer scientist and really expert in visualization. So before that summer internship, I furiously learned JavaScript. And then I worked with another grad student from another grad school to code the application that we did, which was a really fun project. And it was the first time that I really worked in industry. I really liked it. It was still research. Um, IBM gave me a full-time offer, so I had the luxury to enjoy the last year of my PhD, knowing that I had a job at the end, which was really, really nice. And then when I came into IBM full-time, I worked on what became IBM Watson Health. And what I did was working on a software that binds the scientific literature and extracts important concepts so that we can make new connections. So it really helps to accelerate research by forming new connections and also surfacing what is known already. And that's when I started to do some machine learning. So, for example, for extracting text, there's techniques such as natural language processing, but also for this, my first foray in algorithm development, in making these predictions about new concepts that should be linked in the graph, but that are not yet known. And I'll show you a little bit about that in the later part of my talk. So then I switched to Benevolent AI, which is a startup that just went public last year. You heard from Sai, if you were at the panel earlier, who is at Benevolent AI and was my colleague there. And that was a really exciting group of people, really dynamic. And the nice thing is we also had a lab there, so we could actually test some of our predictions, which wasn't the case at IBM. We had to work with partners, and I think that's a really important part of doing medicine or machine learning in medicine, is to be able to actually test what you're predicting, because there's a lot of academic research that doesn't really necessarily make it out to the real world, and it's a shame. And partly it's because there's no way for them to validate their predictions. So I ended up being promoted to leading the data science department. I grew a lot in my years there. It was really wonderful. I wanted to change, as I typically do, as you can see with all the icons on this slide. And so I joined Invite, where today I do a mix of data science, machine learning strategy, product management, team leadership and management. So I've always had quite interdisciplinary jobs. My passion has always been, again, kind of telling stories from data, understanding patterns. And what we do at Invite is that we provide genetic information for millions of people so that they can improve their healthcare. It's rarely boring. It always is challenging me. I want to say, I often feel like I'm an imposter because I'm always putting myself in a situation where I know less than some other folks. But I think that's the beauty of it, to start to be comfortable with that. So let me move on a little bit to, what I think I've learned throughout these years. One thing is that if you invest in self-knowledge and discovery, that really allows you to, what we say, pay it forward, right? People say give it back, but I think paying it forward is a more beautiful way to say it for people who maybe come after you, or people who are in horizontal fields than you. So I really have a lot of debt of gratitude to the Harvard Career Office. I don't think they often get recognized, but I did talk with Laura Stark, and she was really someone who helped me to understand what I wanted to do. PhD is often, people are a little lost and they're not sure what they want to do. She was really instrumental in the program that she put together for me to start to understand who I was and what my preferences were, and not really grade myself from what the external world is saying about me, but really dig deep within me. My coach also, Lisa Alessi, she's a professional coach, a leadership coach, and she's been also extremely instrumental in me understanding who I am, understanding my fears, getting away from my fears, and a lot of other, deeper understanding who I am so that I can really reach my potential. My activities have been really instrumental. I think it's wonderful that at Harvard, often the undergraduate students are really encouraged to pursue other activities besides their academic career. And it really saved me my last 2 years to be doing rowing and waking up early in the morning and I loved it. I wrote with Harvard grad students and MIT as well. And finally, I still to this day I drum in a German group. Making music with people is something that feeds my soul, makes other people happy, and people dance, and that's something that is really important for me. It makes me a better human being, I think. And it allows me to do also things outside of work that pay it forward. So I've been a program mentor at Data Science for All. At Benevolent AI, I worked with other colleagues to work on data diversity, which if we have time, we can dive into a little bit. It's a huge problem in healthcare in particular, and other fields for sure, and making AI programs that are biased from non-diverse data is a big cause of reproducing biases throughout society. I also volunteer in the homeless LGBT youth shelter early on, moving to New York. And finally, recently with Sai, actually, who I keep mentioning at Benevolent AI, we worked with the UCLA LaCoste Behind the Bars project, looking at the impact of COVID with people who are imprisoned, especially women. And so that's been really a wonderful way to feel like I'm involved in this crisis and try to, change policies so that folks who are most disadvantaged can have a voice. So again, I just want to say, the way that I was educated in France, you never look at yourself. It's bad to put yourself forward, but sometimes you have to put yourself forward so that you can actually do the things that are important for you and your community. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears quite completely now towards our second part, which is a machine learning primer in medicine. And I'll first start with a very simple diagram, but again, that even practitioners have a hard time sometimes articulating about what is machine learning. So broadly, artificial intelligence is where it's really the ability of machines to kind of reason and learn like humans. So it's kind of the higher goal. But broadly, in machine learning, it's where the machines learn to perform tasks rather than a human telling the machine exactly what to do. And that's the traditional, computer software. You tell the computer exactly what to do based on an input. In machine learning, the machine kind of learns itself based on patterns that it finds in the data, for example. So that's the real difference, is that it's not explicitly programmed to do something. And it might surprise you. Or again, it might reinforce biases that you didn't realize existed in the data. So, but it can be creative. So there's a lot of really cool things that come out of machine learning. In biomedicine, there's really no pure AI right now, right? We still need human in the loop. We still need doctors, we need researchers to continue to contribute to algorithm so that they are really rooted in expertise, things that are not right now modeled through a computer. And again, that also they are fair, right? Because the machines have no concept of fairness right now. You hear about deep learning a lot, so I just want to mention that, the deep learning is a subset of machine learning where you have artificial neural networks that actually inspired by how the brain works, and they learn and adapt from vast amount of data. So typically for deep learning, you need a lot of data, which is not always what you have. Generally a common goal of machine learning is to develop a predictive model, not always, but typically predict something based on statistical associations among features in the data set. So, it's a mouthful, but essentially it really relies on statistics and also on what we call, feature selection, on understanding what are the important elements of a data set. And then what you do is, once you learn this model, that's in the training phase, you may have heard of that, typically the model can then be used to predict any range of outputs. And typically a model will find patterns. So in an existing data set, right, and then apply that learning in the new data set. So that's a broad introduction. And now I'll talk a little bit about the three different classes of machine learning. Now, some people may have 6 or 8 or 2. So there's different ways to classify machine learning, right? It's not an exact science, but those are kind of the 3 main classes that people tend to talk about. So we have supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. So I know some of you probably have some idea of what supervised learning, what is the defining characteristic of that. So if you want to type that in the chat, what makes supervised learning really different from unsupervised learning? And it has to do with the data set. That's right. Vatsala, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, but you got it. And Shania, I think you were very much on the right track as well. It's the presence of labels. Exactly. So you have class labels on which you can actually train the machine learning. The machine learning is guided. That's, I think, another way to say it. Although I think you might argue that all machine learning we do guide, but I think in a way with supervised learning, it's almost more guided because you have an idea of what you're looking for because you have labels. So some of you might wonder what the hell are labels? And I think through an example, that will become a little bit more clear. So I clicked too much. No? Oh, all right. That's okay. Look at supervised learning. So the defining characteristic, as I said, is really that you have a labeled data set that is provided, and the learning is task driven. So again, you kind of know what you're looking for. That's the task, right? Or you know what you want to do. And the algorithms are trained to improve on the outcome over time. So one example in medicine is that you have a training data set that has pathological features. So let's say, for example, this is the brain of a Parkinson's patient, and there's part of the brain that is much smaller, or that seems different from the brains of individuals without Parkinson's disease. And you want to use the supervised learning to find and diagnose new patients based on their brain scans about whether they do or they do not have Parkinson's. And so that's classically, a classification task. The most classic example is like dogs or cats, but here we're talking about images that say, Parkinson's or not Parkinson's. And so the features of the data set are, the images, and that can be the different, it's represented different pixels of the images. And there are different types of supervised learning that you can do. There's definitely a lot of deep learning in images. But essentially, the difference is that you have examples. You have a data set of people with Parkinson's disease. And so the model is trained to recognize those features. So again, the model will learn itself. You don't necessarily have to guide it towards the area of the brain that is different. It will learn it because it will learn to look at images of Parkinson's and non-Parkinson's and kind of compare the two, just like we do, right? Machine learning is a little bit closer to how humans learn through experience and through identifying patterns. And then, there is definitely in machine learning an important step about evaluating the model and test data. So you reserve part of your data set for testing. You see, how well does it do on another labeled data set that I know is also, I know the label, I know what is Parkinson's or not Parkinson's. And I use the trained model on those images to understand how well it does. And so then you might measure performance. And then finally, when you're happy with the performance, excuse me, you can look at applying the model to unseen data. And so in this case, right, you can now diagnose new patients with or without Parkinson's disease. So that's a simple example, but it really illustrates how supervised machine learning uses labeled data. The other example is unsupervised learning, where no label data set is provided and the output is unknown, because again, the label data set and the output are related, right? You know, in supervised learning, you have labels and you want to predict labels, right? And in supervised learning, that's not the case. So the learning is really based on and recognition. So one example, which is really important in medicine right now, is that you have a heterogeneous patient population. Heterogeneous just means that it's composed of people who are different. Now, we're all different, but sometimes we have some common characteristics that define us. For example, we have Parkinson's disease. And that said, you know, even though we define that as one patient population, typically these patients are also really different from each other, even in a medical sense, right? They have different symptoms. Some patients may have more motor problems, some patients may have more cognitive problems. And so not one drug will work probably for an entire group of heterogeneous patients. And one really push in modern medicine is what you may have heard about precision medicine, which is to make drugs more specific to a patient population or even maybe to an individual with a rare disease. And for that, you really have to be able to classify or to cluster patients into different subpopulation. And so that's what this unsupervised learning is that you don't a priori know what are the different groups that you want to classify these patient into, but you actually want to find clusters of patients who are more similar to each other and who you may identify different subgroups. So I'm pointing to the bottom of the screen here where you see the role of this particular clustering algorithm, which is a type of unsupervised learning, is to find clusters of individuals that are more similar to each other. And that corresponds to patient subtypes that have shared molecular features. So the important thing is that from this patient population, you need some type of data, right? It can be data about their molecular features. So it could be, for example, genetic data. It could also be phenotypic data, basically the data on their traits, maybe their medical history, their different, the results of their medical exams, for example. And then you do unsupervised clustering based on these molecular features. And sometimes you may not even know how many classes there are. The algorithm will figure out what is the best set of clusters that kind of maximizes the difference between the groups. That's often what it does. And then now that you have these patients with that are subclass, you might decide to, again, target a specific drug to a set of patient or even a specific treatment regimen versus another group of patient, realize that they have a different underlying disease and they would benefit from different type of treatment. So the final class that is often talked about is reinforcement learning, which is really interesting. And that's even more how humans actually learn, especially if you've watched young children or remember what it's like to be a young kid. It's often like, I try something and then I get a signal. Yes, it was great. You did great. Or, oh, no, honey, you can't do that. Or like something fell on my head. My goodness, I should go back. I learned that this is not the right way. So we constantly actually, especially as children, as we learn, right, make mistakes, make good improvements, and then we learn based on those. And that's really how also this reinforcement learning algorithm is being trained. So for example, in this case, you may want to understand from from a patient medical history. Again, here, we have the DNA kind of based on that is representing the genome and maybe their medical history, what drugs they've been taking, what have been their visits with doctors. It might really understand what are some side effects, reactions, possibly maybe what is the potential disease progression that you might expect in this patient group. And so what the algorithm does kind of in the diagram is that it chooses an action, it applies that action, and then it will measure whether it made an improvement or not. That's what kind of this done signifies. If it's not an improvement, it will kind of go back. Well, actually, an improvement or an error, it will go back until it's kind of satisfied with the end goal. And then you may measure the outcome kind of. So typically, if the algorithm did a step that was good, you will apply a reward. If it did a step that was not helpful to predicting the outcome, it will give it a punishment. So it learns that way. Great. Okay, so now for the last part, I want to go through an example of machine learning in drug discovery. So first, what is drug discovery? I took this slide from my last company, Benevolent AI. That's really their bread and butter. And I say bread and butter, but it's quite innovative, so it's a little bit more novel than butter. But essentially, there's a lot of diseases that do not have treatment, and even the diseases that you may be very familiar with. Take, for example, depression. Many of you have or know people who have been treated for depression. Actually, if you think about it, you may have heard that they've taken one medication, two medication, and maybe the third one kind of worked, but maybe it didn't work for them for a little bit. It's crazy that even for a disease that is so well understood, well, not well understood at all, so common, not really well understood, it's a lot of the top medication don't work for a lot of patients, right? So we have to do better. So many diseases, cancer obviously is a big one too. And then there's a lot of rare diseases that not many people have. And drug discovery, traditional pharma are not interested in developing drugs because the market is too small and because it's so expensive to create a drug. So we really have to bring the cost of making drugs down, and we have to study more diseases, and we have to be much more targeted in our treatment. As I was talking about before, understand that not all patients with depression are the same. They are going to be treated with different drugs. So one of the ways that we develop drugs typically is we look for genes in the body that are different, that if they are targeted with a small molecule, if you take in chemistry, that's kind of what, with a chemical, typically, they might be inhibited or maybe their activity will be enhanced, and that will actually either alleviate some of the symptoms of the disease or help cure the disease. The problem is that we have 20,000 genes, right? And they make even more proteins than that because there's a lot of complex things that evolution has decided to do that makes our world very difficult. But essentially, think of it as, one gene produces one protein, and the proteins are the molecular effectors in your body. So going back to storytelling, if you remember, if you've ever seen when you were a kid, that book of life with like all the little people inside your body that are repairing things, those are the proteins. I like to think about that. I like to think that inside is not blood, it's like all these little people working inside. I definitely score me to be a doctor. So I like to think about like Lego pieces and people inside me. In any case, those are the people that we want to help, right? The proteins. Or we want to say like, hey, slow down, like you're causing maybe some tumors. Please, just kind of shut up. So we have to develop drugs to kind of target these, but we don't necessarily know which ones because we have 20,000 and we don't really understand what they all do and their connection with disease. Developing small molecule drugs is even more complicated. Again, if you're a chemistry student, you know that there's a 10 to the 20 to 10 to the 60 different possible molecules that you could make. So how do you make a molecule that targets a specific drug? I'll talk more about this problem for this next section. How do you find out which is the gene that you should target for a specific disease? And I'll talk about it from an algorithm that is fairly simple, right? And that's kind of what I started with when we were at IBM. And now we're doing, slightly fancier things, but some of the theory is really interesting. And again, I want to start simple. So the matrix factorization is kind of what we use to essentially match diseases with genes. And the analogy is Netflix, or you're a student and you want to know which is the data science book that you want to read. And you know that your friend Shonda or Michelle, they really like this book, so they rated it like 5 and 4 star. They have no opinion on this book. And they also showed I love this book, and Michelle had no opinion about this other one. And you're maybe deciding what book you want to read based on your affinities with these friends, and maybe those other people, you don't know them, you don't necessarily trust their judgment. So you want to see like how similar you are to these individuals, these friends, and then from that predict whether you might actually like this book that one of your friends hasn't rated, but see whether this is actually a good recommendation for you. So you see that you have this kind of partial graph, and you want, or matrix really, that's why it's called matrix factorization, and you want to kind of reconstruct a final complete graph where those empty areas are actually filled with a recommendation. So this is matrix factorization in general. It's a class of what we call latent factor model, that what they do is they really attempt to find a low rank approximation of this matrix. By low rank, it just means that instead of a giant matrix, this is not super giant, but imagine it's way bigger, you're actually decomposing it into two matrices that are much smaller. And so that's where kind of the latent model comes in. So it's really used, it was used for a really long time with Netflix. Again, now they're in like slightly fancier algorithms, but that's how a lot of the classes of what we call the recommendation engines or recommendation algorithms were built. So how does it work with genes and diseases? Well, you can imagine that over in the last slide, we had individuals and we had books. You can have diseases and genes. And we know from the literature, for example, that's why we use a lot of NLP, natural language processing, and text mining at my previous companies to, first of all, build this graph, or what we represent in terms of a matrix here, of links between diseases and genes. So for example, I know ApoL1 is really important for chronic kidney disease, maybe, and let's say Alzheimer's. I'm not sure about that last one, doesn't matter. So the point is that there are certain areas in the matrix where I know there is a connection between the gene and disease, and other areas where I don't know whether there's a connection, or I know there is no connection. Typically, I don't know whether there's a connection. And basically the algorithm reconstructs, finds from learning through this decomposition, learning to from those two smaller matrices, the learning process is to reconstruct this large matrix. Though in this process, it will also fill out the missing elements. It learns from these two small matrices to reconstruct this big one, and will fill out the missing elements. And that's what I represented here in red, that in the process of doing that, it will actually, is doing pretty well at figuring out that, between gene 1 and disease 1, it should be a 1. It finds 0.8, so that's pretty good. And it's also been filling out those other gene disease connection. And so what we do is that then we are able to figure out in the lab where we can test out this hypothesis, right? So we can say, if I block the activity of this gene in this disease model, does it actually have a beneficial effect? If yes, this is a good prediction. If not, the model may be wrong, the disease model, or my computational model is not right, or the data is wrong. As you can see, it's actually very complicated to figure out what actually happened if you get a negative result, because biology is tricky. But typically that's kind of how you test their algorithm. And we've used that successfully in the past to, for example, repurpose actually drugs for COVID-19, including one that's been approved, which is really amazing, baricitinib. And also for a lot of our drug program, for example, in ulcerative colitis, in glioblastoma, which is a really bad brain cancer, really terrible, and other diseases. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about one of the algorithm behind what I talked about earlier in the unsupervised learning in the clustering type of problem, just to see a different visual of it. So for example, you want to find patient subgroups and kind of understand their biological mechanisms. So those are patient samples. What they are is actually gene expression. So it's essentially measuring how up or down the genes are in this patient sample. And from that, you can use latent variable models or other types of model to kind of find subgroups of patients that are more similar to each other. And that allows you, again, to really be able to make drugs that are much more specific, right, that are more precise for a different group of individual, or maybe even a specific individual. So that's all I had today. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for the chat that I've been only, partially looking at. So looking forward to your questions. There's no dumb question. So please, don't hesitate, and don't hesitate to check me out on LinkedIn too, and connect with me if you'd like to keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Alix. That was a really insightful panel. Even me, I'm someone who doesn't know too much about machine learning, and learning about how it can be connected with medicine and your expertise in the field has been really interesting. So no worries about not looking at chat. We actually have some of the questions. I have them listed here, so I think we can go ahead and maybe ask a few of them. So the first question we have is, what is the difference between AI today versus pure AI? And what are some of the ways that scientists are working towards pure AI?
So at pure AI, is that, do they mean the ability for a machine to really reason and think just like a human, kind of like no difference? An AI system that passes the Turing test? I'm not sure if the person who asked the question maybe can elaborate in the chat. But maybe while that person does or does not do that, there's definitely, as I was talking about in medicine, I think there's not going to be pure AI for a really long time. I think you will have to still have the human in the loop. What's really different, I would say, in medicine is that there's a lot of human knowledge that the computer just doesn't have yet. And you're like, well, why does the computer not have that knowledge? Because the knowledge that humans have is often conflicting, and the machine doesn't do always super well with dealing with conflicting information. It's also really hard to model. So there's a whole interesting type of, part of data science that is about data modeling, which is essentially getting the data to speak the same language, if I can say it that way. So for example, doctors may refer to a specific protein, like for example, the protein I worked on for my PhD, they refer to it as orexin. And in the biomedical or the biological literature, it's referred to as hypocretin. And so there's so much that the computer needs to understand, that these things are the same thing. And there's no one textbook that says, this is what we call ontology, right? This is how these terms are related to each other. So that's why it's a really difficult problem. And achieving a pure AI, whatever that exactly means, is really complex. The other thing I would say is, again, biases creep in a lot. And so we have to be really careful through human review, through even statistical analysis of the data, to understand biases to catch them before they arise. There's also an issue of trust, right, in medicine, and that might prevent us from having pure AI, meaning like no humans involved, let's say, because people want to know and understand why certain decisions are made. And there's a lot of the classes of machine learning that are kind of black boxes. I'm sure you've heard about that. And I know, a lot of academic people and also in industry are working in what we call more interpretable AI, meaning that you can explain a prediction. And that's hugely important as a patient, right, who may not be trusting the healthcare system so much, and even as a doctor who doesn't trust the machine, who trusts their intuition more. So there's still so much progress to be made in this field before we can really achieve a system where there's no human involved. And I'm not sure that's what we want to achieve anyway, no human involved. Time will tell.
Thank you, Alex. The next question is, for an undergraduate student exploring machine learning, which is a more appreciated area in terms of the value it could bring in? Working on research projects or working in a company?
Well, I think both, give you a really different perspective. I think if you want to have a job in industry, unfortunately, often they ask you to have experience in industry. So I would say if you are working in academia, which is really important if you want to do, for example, research in industry, then you should do internships, right? Internships are really, really important. And again, that's where you may go outside of your comfort zone. You may need to go to the career center. You may need to call your friends or friends of friends, which is all in a really uncomfortable process when you first start. But it's really important. So I would say, again, you have in industry, there's research. I'm more on the research side. So we still publish, we really read papers, we're tied into the academic community. And for that, we typically look for people who have academic research experience. But then we also want people who have industry experience, ideally, because they understand, how to code in a production level environment, which is very, very different than what we do in academia. And we also want people, who have experience kind of with the speed at which we do things in industry, which is different than what we do in academia. So if you want to stay in academia, you don't necessarily need to go to industry. But I think if you want to go to industry, if you want to do research, do some research in your academic institution, but also do some industry internships. If you want to be a software engineer in our industry, you don't necessarily need to do academic research at all, right? And you may learn a ton by going directly to industry. Hope that helps.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is, what energizes you to continue to work in the medicine/tech space?
I'm really excited to make a difference. As you can tell, I talk a lot about neurological diseases. I'm really passionate about removing some of the stigma for people who have brain diseases. And I'm also really passionate about finding new treatments for them. I think another thing that I really love about Invite, my current company, is that we're doing something really innovative, which is that we want to provide a platform for individuals to own their data, their healthcare data. First of all, to be able to find it. So we have a system where you can request your medical records from all the places that you've been at, and then put them in a format that can be read by a machine, so you can do additional analyses, but also so that you can use it to kind of view your patient journey. For some of you who are perfectly healthy, it might not seem like something that's really so exciting. But for others who may have, issues, which most of us, have some kind of health issue or some kind of desire to be healthier in one way or another, it can really provide a lot more insights. And right now, it's really fragmented data in your healthcare data, super fragmented. And then there's some companies that actually get it from insurers without your permission and without you owning the data. And at Invite, we think that's really not the way to go. We want you to really own your data. If there's revenue to be made from your data because companies are trying to find a new cure for your disease, you may decide to volunteer your data, or maybe they want to pay for it, and we kind of provide that ability to do the transaction. But really, we believe that if we have all the healthcare data together, we can really understand health and disease so much better, do screening earlier, diagnosis earlier, do better treatment plans, and also, again, where my heart is find novel medicine.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is, how did you find your educational journey at an Ivy League? Would you attribute a big part of your success and admirable accomplishments to your passion for your area of study?
Yes, I think passion has a big part of it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, all the people who helped me along the way. I think as someone, just scanning as asked about advice, I think one thing is that often we listen too much to the people who say, oh, you can't do this or you can't do that. Even people who don't know they're being a bummer when, but they are. Like my dad was like, oh, well, I think you have to be a doctor to be a neuroscientist. Like, oh, well, okay, well, I'll try film for a while. It's like, it was fine. I was really lucky because, again, I persisted and I found my way. But it's so interesting that sometimes, you kind of listen to bad advice or people who tell you can't do this or that. So just, really listen to people who tell you, yes, you can. And it's hard sometimes because you feel like you don't know anything. Like, I still feel like I don't know anything. Like, I joined Invitae in September and I'm like, genetics, this is so complicated. There's so much that I don't know. Or, I'm learning a lot about Bayesian machine learning, which is fascinating, but I really, I don't have a background in that. So I think it's about, the love of learning definitely, I think has taken me further, but also, as I was talking about, I think the community that I've built, that people have helped me and that I like to pay forward. It's also a big part of being involved in science that matters. And I think persistence and hard work, right? Which, I mean, you're all here probably on a Saturday because you do have that hard work. It's as we say, right? It's learning anything is 80% work, 10% maybe some kind of innate ability to do. So.
Thank you. We have a few more questions here. One that I have is, you need to have a biology background to work in ML plus medicine applications.
So you don't. It can help, but again, it's a very interdisciplinary field, which is why it's so wonderful, because everyone feels kind of like an imposter because they don't know as much on one thing. Like maybe they don't know as much computer science, or don't know as much computer biology, or don't know anything about genetics, and they're still at a genetics company because maybe they're developing applications that, for example, we need software engineers who work on making the process of ordering a genetic test for your medical condition easy, right? And it doesn't require a very deep understanding of genetics. It's actually a pretty more straightforward kind of customer service type of job, but it's really fascinating because you get to be involved in this community of people who want to help bring genetics to mainstream medicine, and you're around people who know more of the science, but you know more about how to make an application work. So you don't need that. And I think, again, if you're hesitant, if you're not sure like where you should go, I think do follow what you really love to do. And one thing I did do is try not to close door. It does help, I have to say. But at the same time, I do think that if you really follow what you're passionate about, it usually opens door rather than closes. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is, what kind of machine learning projects have you worked on?
Yeah, so I worked on a lot of the natural language processing. So, for example, in text, trying to understand the relationship between, I talked about genes and diseases. Some of those are fairly straightforward. But for example, understanding the effect of a mutation and how you actually represent that in a tabular format eventually, right? How do you read the text intelligently to do so? I worked on some of the graphical models that I talked about. So matrix factorization was kind of the first model that I really worked on in that space. Once you have a graph, how do you turn that into making predictions? And then later on, I worked on convolutional graphical models for doing this kind of prediction. Now we work a lot on Bayesian graphical models. So that involves kind of representing what is known about biology in a type of graph and understanding the associations between those graph elements to predict the new associations. So yeah, I think some of these and probably others that I forget about.
Awesome, thank you. We got two more questions. One of them is, how would you advise someone who's interested in AI and trying to start learning it and getting familiar with it?
Yeah, there is, if you don't have the chance to do this formally at your school, there are a lot of resources definitely online to do so. It can be overwhelming because it's a really vast field. Like I said, even though I've been working in AI for 8 years or so, since 2014, there's still total branches of AI that I really don't know. Like, for example, we do AI for operations, for optimizing schedules and machines in the lab. And like, I really don't know very much about that. So, I think you have to think about like, okay, what do I want to learn? You probably want to take the basics, right, of machine learning. A lot of people take Andrew NG's class on Coursera. Now it's on YouTube as well. But maybe ask yourself, like, who are the people who are working on applications that I'm really excited about beyond kind of the basics, and then what kind of machine learning they're using, and then try to go a little bit deeper into that area, because again, you're not going to be able to learn everything. But that said, you can also continue. Definitely, Coursera continues to have some really great courses. And the ability to learn on your own is definitely a really good skill to have, and persist in that. But thankfully, again, we are in an era where there's a lot that can be learned by yourself using online resources.
Awesome. And then last but not least, we got our last question here, which kind of ties in everything together and kind of more of a reflection question. But the question is, what are some things that you wish you knew earlier in your career? Maybe things that would have given you a potential boost. Are there any regrets that you have?
I wish I learned more computer science. So yay, you guess I probably you already are learning more computer science. So I think just more broadly, I think because I did a lot of self-knowledge, sometimes I didn't really have the basics, and I kind of went straight to something like, if you imagine the knowledge being a tree. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I had trouble with this. So sometimes I learned like a branch of knowledge or a leaf of knowledge before I really understood like the foundation and the trunk of knowledge. And I realized that sometimes that's made my learning a little slower. The other thing is like confidence. I talked about, persistence, and hard work is 80% of work. Oh my goodness, like confidence is so much of it too. And I know it's hard to be confident when you're not confident. Just remember that everybody has problems with confidence, and it's common. Give yourself, just be nice to yourself, be grateful. I think gratitude has been such a big thing in my life that has helped me also to achieve new things and have more confidence, is just give thanks a lot. And even if I don't say it in person, do these exercises of gratitude. So yeah, it's not easy to have confidence in yourself, but work on it like anything, and it will really pay off.
All right, those are all our questions. Thank you so much again for speaking with our students here. We really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot from this discussion, so thank you just again for taking the time out on your Saturday morning to speak with us today.
Thank you for the wonderful questions and feedback. Really appreciate it. Keep in touch.
Of course. Alrighty, bye everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty. Bye.